Good evening. Welcome back to Woke Nation. I realize this episode's a little bit delayed. I think I put out a post on Facebook for those of you that follow me there. Um, just, I'm sure everybody's traveling, everybody's trying to catch up on the last of their holiday um, shopping and all the plans they have, putting the final, dotting the I, crossing the T on all your final holiday plans and adventures. Like everybody else in that category, this episode was a little delayed. That notwithstanding, it gave me some time to actually find something kind of concrete and outside of the box. Normally, during this time period, you would hear all sorts of different podcast episodes talking about the nativity or Santa Claus or, or or presents really aren't what's important. It's being together as a family, being a cheerful giver, and the like, and so on. All of those things are very valuable and important. And actually, next week I will have a very specifically oriented, targeted Christmas episode. But in the meantime, this delay, like I said, gave me a little time to find something that was a little outside the box that you would typically see at this time of year. Um, St. Anselm, who is the Archbishop of Canterbury and one of the earliest of the Church Fathers, along with around the same time period as Irenaeus or Augustine of Hippo, or this is prior to Aquinas, but Anselm wrote a book called Why, in Latin it's Cur Deus Homo, which is the Why the God Man, and the book seek to address the question of why Jesus taking human form was absolutely necessary to the salvation of mankind, and not just our salvation, but more broadly speaking, he took on a much more broader context to that theological theme in addressing something that we don't hear about all that often today, which is God's honor, the honor of God. Uh, Part of his argument was that the incarnation was absolutely necessary for God to uphold his honor. You remember that in the book of Genesis, Adam and Eve in the garden fell. They sinned against God. They ate the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil against God's command, and plunged the whole human race into sin and misery. Well, Adam in the garden was our representative, and he had what's called the covenant of works with God, where during this short period in the garden, if he obeyed God's command not to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, then theoretically all of humankind would be would be perfect, that we would not sin. So it seems that the opportunity, that a testing period, was a like I said, only a period. But in any case, Adam failed and plunged and broke the covenant of works, as it's called. So part of what Jesus returned to earth, or came to earth to accomplish in his incarnation as fully God and fully man in human form, was to fulfill the covenant of works which Adam broke or destroyed, and in doing so he damaged, if that's probably not the best word for it, but brought reproach. Adam brought reproach on the honor of God. And so what Jesus was doing was repairing, or restoring would be a better word, restoring the honor of God. And Anselm spends some significant time in Cur Deus Homo, Why the God Man, in outlining this thesis, this doctrine, if you want to call it that, God's honor, the restoration of God's honor. Part of what Christ came here to do was to restore God's honor, and to uphold his honor, and to fulfill, or fix, or repair, restore the covenant of works. We don't, again, I don't hear many people talking about, God's honor, or God's holiness, or God's righteousness a whole lot in the country. in the churches that I've visited here lately up around Harrisburg, I almost never hear this spoken about or preached about or talked about in the sermons, in the Sunday schools, um, in podcasts. It's just not something that really gets spoken of a whole lot. By and large, in today's, and I've talked about this time in and time out, by and large in today's churches, what we hear about is the love of God, the love of God. God is love. God is a giant teddy bear in the sky who's only interested in desperately seeking out people that just want nothing to do with him. And his heart bursts for people. I just, I don't think that's the proper view of what God's love is. I really don't. Be that as it may, you just don't hear a whole lot about his honor, or that what Christ came to do was also to restore the honor of God that Adam um, uh, laid waste to, or smeared. That's a good way to put it. Smeared the honor of God. Because it can't be damaged, that God cannot be personally he's not a physical being, but he can be wounded or hurt or damaged, but his name, his honor can be blasphemed or dragged through the dirt. And that's kind of what Adam did and what Christ came to fix, repair, restore. And part of what comes from knowing about the honor of God, or the holiness and the righteousness of God, is a healthy sense of fear and respect. The Bible talks about the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And there's many different ways that you can talk about fear. Some, in one sense, it could mean, holy terror, shaking in your boots in absolute abject terror. That is one way you could look at it. And if you look through the Old Testament in particular, or even the New Testament, any human being that is put in the presence of any sort of supernatural being, whether it's God in spirit form, or an angel, usually that human being is struck rigid with fear and terror. Look at the angel, or Mary. When the angel came to her, she was at first afraid. Joseph, Zechariah, all these people terrified when the angel of the Lord first appeared to them. And the angel usually starts out his tidings, or his sayings, or his message from God, by saying, fear not. And if you look back through the Old Testament, there's Moses at the burning bush. There's just as many verses and chapters that deal with human beings being terrified. When the Israelites were brought before the foot of Mount Sinai, the mountain that God dwelled on, that he later, the mountain where Moses went up and got the Ten Commandments, the people were terrified of even being within the shadow of the mountain, because of the presence of God in the mountain. They could hear it, the lightning, the thunder, the rumbling, and they were struck with terror at being in his presence. And they'd asked Moses, tell God not to speak to us, not to speak to you, because the sound of his voice and his communication just filled them with terror. So that's one sense of the word fear. But when the Bible talks about the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and this is, I think, more in keeping with the idea of respect and awe, and that, I think, has been largely missing. Both senses of the word fear have been largely missing from America today. But the first one, or I should say the second, the awe and the respect and the reverence is definitely gone by the wayside. Even in the churches, you just watch a contemporary worship service and you can see that there's really not a whole lot of fear of the Lord in any of the people there. They just kind of waltz into the service with their cell phones still on. You can see people filming the worship band, filming the pastor, sending text messages, going in and out of the sanctuary during communion, during the sermon, during the songs, whatever. They're coming and going as they please. There's people. If you go to some of these mega churches that I visited, there's entire little there's lounge areas outside of the sanctuary where people just kind of are sitting throughout the entire service, just talking to each other, talking about the football game, the baseball game, the car show they're going to go to once the service is over, the very service that they're not sitting in on and are participating in. So, I mean, this idea of the fear of the Lord seems to have evaporated from the church. And if it evaporates from the church, it's also going to evaporate from the culture, from secular culture, because where are they going to get their knowledge of the fear and reverence of the Lord if not from the church itself? And if the church is not exhibiting that, then surely the culture, the secular culture, will not either. And when this happens, you get such things as when that reverence disappears, that healthy awe and fear, and maybe not abject terror, but that you're in the presence of a being that is so far beyond your comprehension, and who's so holy and righteous that if you looked on him you would die. You could never stand in his presence on your own, the Bible says. That respect and awe and reverence for such a being just goes by the wayside, as I said. And what you get is then a lackadaisical approach to God himself, and the culture begins to create God in their own image, and very often, if not all the time, what that means is a God that we can control, that is more serves us rather than us serving him. And then what follows after that is logically consistent in that we mock God and we blaspheme him. And we've started to approach that point here in the culture because just the gospel and actual biblical truth just isn't being taught anymore. So why would secular people who know nothing about God have any respect for him if they're not learning anything about him in schools, in the church, in the home? They have no idea who he is. And so things that are sacred, like the nativity, the incarnation, the atonement, the sacrifice of Christ, the resurrection, all these kinds of things are now openly mocked and blasphemed and cursed and ridiculed. Case in point, and I'm going to read this if you go to, let me see if I can bring it up on my phone here, this article here, Netflix has just uploaded a video onto their streaming service. It's called The First Temptation of Christ, and it's in Portuguese, but it's, the subtitles are in English. The movie is described as a parody, and the movie's teaser on Netflix reads, Jesus, who's turning 30, brings a, quote, surprise guest to meet his family. But Netflix in Brazil has received a strong response from its viewers in South America after the streaming service scheduled a Christmas special billed as a, quote, dark comedy about a, quote, gay Jesus. As of this writing, more than 1.4 million people have signed a Change.org petition asking the streaming service, that would be Netflix, to remove The First Temptation of Christ. The way the petitioners are signing, the backers should make their goal of 1.5 million signatures. They call for, quote, removing the film from the Netflix catalog and for the backdoor to be held responsible for the crime of villainous faith. We also want public retraction as they have seriously offended Christians. This is from officials in Brazil. The movie was produced by a comedy group called Dos Fundos, a comedy troupe of 5 people from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, who started filming sketches and parodies on their YouTube channel. Some have likened the comedians' work to Monty Python films of the 1970s and 80s. I do want to say very quickly, I watched the trailer for this First Temptation of Christ, and just from a quality standpoint, as far as wit, satire, uh, just the verbal skills of the writers, they are nowhere near the level of Monty Python. I mean, I've grown up watching Monty Python. I do not avow everything Monty Python has said or done. Just as a very pertinent example, Monty Python made the movie Life of Brian about a character named Brian who was born in a stable just next door to Jesus, and then goes throughout his life, being mistaken for a type of Messiah, messianic figure, and is eventually crucified. The movie's blasphemous. I would never suggest anyone watch that. And, I understand those who would never watch anything Monty Python did just because of that movie. I would fully understand that. I enjoy the Flying Circus, which was their TV show, but that's beside the point. But this group, the movie appears to me to be just purely run off of a delight in being offensive and blasphemous and vulgar. That's the impression I got from watching the teaser and skipping through some scenes in the film itself. It is on Netflix now here in America. But this isn't the only example. I would encourage everyone, just briefly, to go to change.org and sign the petition to get this movie removed from Netflix, which I think is the appropriate response. I don't think legal action should be taken in any of these cases, and I'm going to get to that, my opinion on legal action in moral cases in just a second here. But that's the appropriate response is the citizens, the people that would be purchasing or who are buying goods from Netflix. Let the market decide these kinds of things from a moral standpoint. I've always said that if you arrive at a point where a culture is embracing and accepting blasphemous films like this one, pursuing the film to remove it through legislative efforts, to me says you've already lost the war, because this is a spiritual and moral issue. It is not a legal issue. Much as I despise this film, without even having seen the whole thing, it's described as blasphemous, vulgar, and disrespectful. The comedy group themselves acknowledge this. They're well aware that a film about a quote gay Jesus is blasphemous, and they don't care. So I despise that, and I despise the film itself. But making something like that illegal is not gonna solve the problem. It would just mean that the film would be released on the black market. It would receive a kind of martyrdom cult status, and this is a hard issue. And if people are saying, I think it's okay for films like this to be made, then you going and putting pressure on representatives or senators to then ban said film doesn't accomplish anything whatsoever. The battleground on issues like this are in the church. If the church is not preaching gospel, is not preaching truth, is not preaching the attributes and character of God, so that the culture is aware that there of what I spoke earlier, the fear of the Lord. If we have a healthy knowledge of who God is, and not that there's an unhealthy, you know what I mean, though. Like, if you have a healthy fear of God, like I described earlier, then the culture would reject films of this kind, and legislating against such films. It just accomplishes absolutely nothing. There's another video game. There's a video game coming out called I Am Jesus Christ, and you can go on change.org, I believe, and sign the petition against this video game also, where you actually play out as a first-person character video game. You portray Jesus and go around and I assume perform miracles, and I mean, you don't get more blasphemous than that. How trivializing, how utterly disgusting to. And it just shows that the whoever made this video game have no concept whatsoever of who they are making fun of and ridiculing by this video game. It's just a total trivialization of holiness and the power of God. What a mockery of something that is actually so vital and precious to humanity at large. This is not a small thing that Christ came here to earth. It is not a small thing that he became fully God and fully man. I would encourage the people that make such atrocious video games to go and read Anselm's Cur Deus Homo, Why the God Man, and then read the four Gospels and get a healthy sense of who you are as a sinner, and then think about it a little more before you make such a stupid video game, such a blasphemous game. But again, the issue is not a legislative one. I don't see banning the game as accomplishing anything whatsoever. If people want to play the game, then that's the problem. It's not that it's legally allowed. So what? It's the fact that people want to play a game like that is the problem. And this leads me into kind of where I'll end this. On Twitter, I think a week and a half ago, a number of conservatives, one of them being Matt Walsh, who I don't like at all, not a big fan of him at all. Maybe on a personal level, he's a nice guy. Doesn't seem like it to me, but his opinions are garbage most of the time. He went on Twitter going on some kind of insane rant about how pornography should be banned outright, and that those who film pornography or view it should become criminals and be jailed. This is stupid, insanely stupid. Anyone who's listened to my podcast over the however long you've been listening, but recently I've made 3 or 4 or 5 different episodes possibly on my opinions on pornography. So you can go refer to those and see kind of where I stand on that whole issue, and you'll see that I have a very low opinion of the porn industry. It's not art, it's absolute corruption. It's disgusting. It vilifies or just totally demeans women. It encourages rape. There's a whole slew of evils that come out of it. It's a genuine addiction, according to the statistics or the actual science on it. It rewires your brain in the same way cocaine or heroin does. And masturbation, I hate to say it, which most people that view a lot of porn, or they go hand in hand, no pun intended. That release that you get from viewing porn is it just as powerful as a hit of cocaine, from what they say. So I do not support pornography. I think it's absolutely a disgusting, abominable industry that is very, largely responsible for the corruption of youth. And the list just goes on and on. The total degradation of society, the destruction of morals. How many marriages has it ruined? I mean, countless. How many Christians have had their spiritual walk just totally I wouldn't say destroyed, because God is ultimately in charge of all that. He says in his word that he is faithful, that when he begins a good work in somebody, i.e. salvation, he is faithful and just to follow it through to the day of completion. So, I mean, somebody who's a true Christian, even if they fall into watching porn, that's not the end of their spiritual life. God will bring them out of that and restore them if they're a true Christian. But it can cause a heck of a lot of damage. It can destroy marriages, destroy family relationships. There can be legal issues if you fall into a dark enough hole, if you start viewing stuff that's illegal, there can be a whole host of consequences, not to mention your own just absolute descent into depravity, because as you view more and more and more of it, it takes harder core pornography to actually satisfy you, so that and then there's that loathing, as you realize, well, this should disgust me what I'm viewing, and it's not. So, there's this knowledge that there's something intensely wrong with you by that point. So it's just bad all around. There's nothing positive about it. There's nothing good about it. I think it encourages the rape culture that I don't think is broad the way the left talks about it, but certainly the way men treat women has to be affected by when men watch pornography. That has to have an effect on how we treat women, and women are treated absolutely horribly in these videos in the porn industry. They're spit on, kicked, punched, slapped. And rape scenarios are played out for people's viewing enjoyment, and it's, I'm sure, very realistic. I've heard people describe it, and it's disgusting. It looks just like a rape. I mean, tell me that doesn't have a tremendously negative impact on a young person who's 13, 14, 15 years old. Even adults shouldn't be watching that, but imagine a 12-year-old who's watching a perfectly choreographed rape scene. And this is something that it becomes dangerous, because then they're getting pleasurable release from watching sexual assault. That's bad. So I in no way defend pornography, but these conservatives, Matt Walsh, Michael Knowles, some of the others, first off, the as I said earlier about blasphemy, it's the same argument. If you have a culture that by and large thinks pornography is not a negative thing and it's okay for us to view it, and it's largely a positive thing, you'll hear a lot of people today say masturbation is healthy for you. So viewing porn is not a bad thing. These videos are videos that can be viewed in the privacy of your home between consenting adults, and it can actually help your sex life. I've heard all the pro arguments for it. They're all rubbish, but that's beside the point, whether they're rubbish or not. The fact remains that if you have a society that by and large thinks that this is a good thing and is healthy and not a negative, is not sin, then you've lost the battle if your response to that. You've lost the war if your response to it is, let's go make it illegal and throw the people in jail who are viewing it or creating it. I mean, that is just so wrong-headed and empty-headed on so many levels. Think about it like this. If Matt Walsh had his way, your 16-year-old son who has a few Playboy magazines underneath his bed would all of a sudden become a criminal. And if he was a repeat offender in that area, theoretically, logically, consistently with Matt Walsh's vision of a moral America, of the common good, that child, a 16-year-old, would then be put in prison for the crime of owning pornography. Not child porn, not bestiality, a Penthouse magazine or something of the kind, with just, regular sex being shown in it. Hardcore or not, it doesn't matter. Now he's in prison with actual rapists, with actual burglars, with actual murderers, and a child who has a moral failing in the issue of sexuality and would be better served being dealt with between a parent and a youth pastor or your priest or whatever. That's how it should be dealt with. Instead, are now put in a prison complex with actual rapists. All that's going to do is serve to embitter the child against the legal system, embitter the child against your parents, because deep down he knows that this is hogwash, that this is an actual crime, and now he's rubbing shoulders and on a day, being molded and taken under the wing of people who are genuine, actual criminals. And so now all you've done is actually create a criminal by doing this. You did it legally by outlawing porn, and then you really did it by putting him him in a situation where he is spending all his time with true, genuine menaces to society and being brought under their wing and now cultivated and brought up as a real criminal. This is just wrong and stupid on its head. But people like Matt Walsh think that this is, the common good. I mean, the common sense tells you that, who defines then the common good? If you have somebody, let's say Matt Walsh became president and he said, you know what, for the common good, we're going to say porn is bad and we're going to outlaw it. All that does is then set a precedent for the next president to come along and define for himself what common good is and outlaw something that he thinks is bad. You know what? The next time it could actually be the Bible, because right now we're facing a crisis in the culture, a clash between two different types of thinking, where homosexuality and all these other sexual proclivities are being viewed as a natural way of, expressing yourself. This is who you are. And over here on the other side, on the conservative Christian side, you have God's law and what God says, and the two are clashing. And if you say on the one hand, well, when a Christian becomes president, he can outlaw homosexuality or outlaw pornography, what do you think is going to happen when a secularist becomes president? He's going to outlaw the Bible. He's going to outlaw Christianity. He's going to outlaw prayer. He's going to outlaw mission, evangelism, street evangelism, go down the list. So outlawing pornography, well, it might sound like, it sounds like a great soapbox to stand on top of and proclaim your virtue, which Matt Walsh is great at doing. But all it does is seek to set an incredibly bad and dangerous precedent. Nothing is gained by it because, again, I tell you, if you have a society that thinks that pornography is good and is not bad, then if your response is to legislate against them, then you've lost the war. The battle is a moral and a spiritual one. Go to your church. Ask your priest, Matt Walsh, because you're Catholic. Ask your priest why he is not preaching sermons specifically dealing with pornography and pornography addiction. Why is he not preaching sermons on it? Does your church have counseling along these lines? What kind of outreach are you doing in the community if this is such a damning issue? If so many people are being destroyed by it, what are you doing for it besides just blabbing off on Twitter? People are always brave and virtuous when they have a large Twitter following and they can get a lot of likes and a few retweets. But what is he actually doing about it in real life? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And what tells you even more of how wrong-headed they are is that the very next day, Michael Knowles, who I actually do like, he gets on Twitter and he says, and addressing people that disagree with Matt Walsh, he said, and now you, the pro-porn group of the conservatives, and he put us all in quotation marks, conservatives, calling anyone who disagreed with Matt Walsh pro-porn. There is nothing pro-porn about my position, and it's actually very disgusting and disingenuous that they would frame it in that way, to say that just because you think it's a bad idea to outlaw it, then I'm pro-porn. I have a lot of things there's a lot of things in this country I don't think that should necessarily be criminalized that I am absolutely opposed to. Prostitution's one, marijuana, alcohol abuse. There's a lot of things that are wrong and evil and sin, but I don't think that criminalizing them is the solution for reducing people's involvement in it and reducing the impact on the culture spiritually and morally. I just don't see that as the answer. And for the reasons that many people have said, that the common good is a subjective thing. You have no basis for it. Your version of common good is different than the next guy's. And if you come to power and you legislate your common good, you've set a precedent and the next guy's going to do the same thing. And if he totally disagrees with you, don't go crying to mommy when all of a sudden Christianity is outlawed, or the Bible, or prayer, or anything that the Eucharist or the Virgin Mary cannot be spoken about in public. Where would you be then, Matt Walsh? You've set this precedent. Now you have to live by it. It's just a bad idea. And I find it absolutely devastatingly ironic that conservatives, the ones who talk about upholding free speech, Matt Walsh gets on his podcast and talks about how, even speech that we find reprehensible must be defended because speech, we must defend free speech no matter what. Just because it's offensive doesn't mean that we should outlaw it. But then when it comes to something that's, it's like a tough issue for him, ban it. It shows that he really doesn't believe what he's saying. He's not a true conservative. He's a hypocrite. That's what it really boils down to. And that's why right now there's a huge rift going on in the conservative movement, split down the middle between people that are actually America first and actually embrace true conservative Christian values. Ironically, like Tucker Carlson would be put in that category. There's Nicholas Fuentes. There's a whole slew of these people that are starting to wake up and realize that these big conservative Inc., what they call gatekeepers like Ben Shapiro, Matt Walsh, the Daily Wire, Charlie Kirk, Candace Owens, all these people are not actually conservatives. What are they conserving really? They compromise on biblical morals. Charlie Kirk calls himself a Christian, but then he gets up there and says, he just has thrown his hands up and surrendered on the whole issue of homosexuality and gay marriage and everything. What you do is your business. That's not true. That's not true. It doesn't mean we should ban homosexuality, but me saying that we shouldn't ban it is actually a far cry from saying that we should throw up our hands and do nothing about it. There's a lot that can be done about it, starting with churches actually preaching the gospel and the full counsel of God. Start there and then begin your work in the culture. Forget the legislation. That gets you nowhere. It never has been the answer. Look at prohibition. That's all you need to know. Anyway, next week we'll have an episode on Santa Claus and his elves, and I'm not sure what day I'll put it out, but it'll be before Christmas. Today's the 16th, so we're coming up on Christmas quick. I hope you got all your shopping done and you're making merry with your eggnog. In the meantime, good night. I am Eric Swallow and Eric Kamela. Good night, and God be with you.